If you hear this transmission, do not come looking for us, the voice crackled through the headset beneath a storm of static. This valley is gone. The radio cut out a half-second before the explosion tore through the mountain pass. The blast rolled across the Afghan valley like thunder trapped between stone walls, swallowing the convoy in fire, snow, and dust. Claire Bennett felt the shockwave hit her sniper perch 80 yards above the road. One moment she was tracking movement through her scope from a narrow overwatch ledge, and the next the mountainside itself seemed to collapse beneath her boots. Her rifle slammed against the rocks as the force threw her backward into the snow. The world vanished into white silence. Hours later, Claire opened her eyes to darkness and freezing wind scraping across her face. At first she couldn't hear anything except a dull ringing deep inside her skull. Snow covered half her body, packed hard against her uniform like concrete. She tried to move her left arm and pain shot through her shoulder sharp enough to steal her breath. For several seconds she stayed still, staring upward at the faint gray sky above the canyon while snow drifted down through the smoke hanging over the valley. Then training took over. Claire forced herself upright one slow inch at a time. Her gloves were stiff with ice. Blood had dried along the side of her neck beneath her headset, but the bleeding had stopped. Around her, the ridgeline looked completely different than it had before the explosion. Jagged stone covered the narrow overlook where she had been positioned only hours earlier. Her Barrett rifle lay half buried nearby. Claire crawled toward it immediately. Her hands moved over the weapon with automatic familiarity, checking the optic, chamber, and barrel before she even checked herself again. The scope was cracked along one edge, but usable. The rifle still functioned. That mattered. Below her, the convoy route had become a scar of black smoke stretching through the valley floor. One vehicle burned near the cliff wall while another had vanished beneath fallen rock. The silence disturbed her more than the explosion had. No radio chatter. No emergency flares. No movement from the SEAL convoy she had been assigned to protect overnight. Claire grabbed her radio mic with frozen fingers. Overwatch 3 to command, this is Bennett. Radio check. Nothing answered except static. She tried again, this time louder. Command, respond. Still nothing. The wind pushed smoke through the canyon in long dark waves. Claire slowly stood despite the pain in her shoulder and scanned the valley through her damaged scope. Shapes appeared through the haze. Broken equipment. Snow drifting over tire tracks. Pieces of canvas snapping in the wind. But no operators. No rescue teams. No Commander Ethan Cole. Claire lowered the rifle slightly. Ethan Cole was not just another officer. Every sniper attached to Task Unit Raider knew his reputation. 15 years leading operations through mountains exactly like these. Calm under pressure. Never left anyone behind. 6 hours earlier she had watched him moving through the convoy below her, checking every vehicle personally before the team entered the pass. He had looked up toward her perch before departure and pressed 2 fingers against his helmet. A silent acknowledgement between professionals. Then the mountain exploded. Claire checked her watch. 4:37 a.m. 4 hours since the blast. Temperatures were dropping below 20 degrees and dawn was still far away behind the clouds. She keyed the radio again. Any station copy? A burst of static answered before a weak voice finally broke through. Rescue birds inbound at first light, all units presumed lost. Claire froze. Presumed lost. The transmission repeated once more before disappearing entirely beneath interference. She stared down at the valley again. Headquarters believed everyone was dead. She adjusted her rifle against her shoulder and began moving carefully down the frozen slope toward the blast zone. Every step sent pain through her body, but she ignored it. Snow crunched beneath her boots while smoke drifted through the narrow canyon. The closer she got, the quieter the valley felt. Claire reached the road 20 minutes later. One armored truck sat twisted against the cliffside, nearly buried in rubble. Nearby, shattered equipment had frozen into the snow. She moved slowly through the wreckage, eyes scanning constantly the way sniper school had trained her years ago. Observe first. Move second. Survive always. Then she saw it. A trail in the snow leading away from the convoy. Faint. Uneven. Almost invisible beneath drifting powder. Claire crouched lower. Someone had been dragged through the canyon after the explosion. Beside the trail sat a single brass shell casing partially buried in snow. Not enemy ammunition. Seal issue. Fresh enough that frost hadn't settled inside it yet. Claire picked it up silently. Her breathing slowed. Somebody had survived. Then she noticed something else farther ahead near the rocks. A smear of blood leading north into the mountains. Claire looked toward the dark ridgeline disappearing into the storm. Every instinct told her the valley was no longer safe. But another instinct spoke louder. Ethan Cole was still alive. And somewhere beyond those mountains, someone else knew it too. Claire Bennett followed the blood trail north through the frozen canyon while the first hints of dawn remained hidden behind thick storm clouds. Snow continued falling in thin sheets across the mountains, covering tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. The cold had become a living thing now, pressing through her gloves, her boots, even the layers beneath her combat jacket. Every breath burned inside her lungs. But the trail was still there. Faint. Uneven. Deliberate. Whoever moved through this valley after the explosion had been injured badly enough to leave signs behind, yet disciplined enough to keep moving toward higher ground. Claire stopped beside a jagged rock formation and crouched low, scanning the ridge above her through the damaged scope mounted on her Barrett rifle. Nothing moved except blowing snow. No thermal signatures. No radio chatter. Just silence. The kind of silence experienced operators learn to fear. She looked down again at the marks cutting through the powder. Drag marks. Boot impressions. Drops of frozen blood no larger than coins. Commander Ethan Cole had taught his team something during winter warfare training 2 years earlier in Colorado. Never leave obvious signs for the enemy. Leave signs for the people trained to find you. At the time Claire had barely spoken to him outside official briefings, but she remembered every word. Especially now. She moved carefully through the canyon wall, keeping close to shadows and avoiding open ground whenever possible. Her shoulder throbbed constantly beneath her jacket, but she ignored it the same way she ignored exhaustion. Snipers learned early that pain became background noise if survival depended on focus. The wind shifted suddenly from the west, carrying a faint smell of burned fuel through the valley. Claire froze immediately. Then she heard it. Metal scraping against stone somewhere ahead. Soft. Controlled. Not natural. She lowered herself behind a ridge and studied the terrain carefully. About 150 yards ahead, partially hidden between boulders, sat the remains of a communications case. One of the convoy radio packs. Its antenna had snapped in half, but someone had opened the unit recently. Snow around it had melted slightly from body heat before freezing again. Claire approached slowly. The case had been marked with a strip of dark tape near the handle. Not random. A signal. Her pulse slowed. Commander Cole used tape markers during reconnaissance operations to guide extraction teams through hostile terrain without verbal communication. Most operators never noticed the habit. Claire had. She opened the damaged case carefully and found a handheld recorder still blinking weakly beneath cracked plastic. The battery indicator flashed red. One final recording remained. Claire pressed play. Static flooded the speaker before a strained voice emerged beneath heavy interference. If this reaches command, convoy compromised, the audio cut briefly. Wind roared through the microphone. Then Ethan Cole's voice returned, lower now, controlled but tired. Someone knew our route before deployment. This was not random. Do not trust. Another burst of static interrupted the message. Claire leaned closer instinctively. Secure the drive before dawn. The transmission ended there. Claire stared at the recorder for several seconds without moving. Secure the drive. Her eyes narrowed slightly. The mission briefing before deployment had been unusually restricted. Even Sniper Overwatch had received only partial intelligence regarding the convoy movement through the valley. Whatever Commander Cole had been transporting mattered enough for someone to set an ambush deep inside hostile terrain during a snowstorm. Claire slipped the recorder into her vest pocket and scanned the ridgeline again. This time something felt different. The valley no longer felt abandoned. It felt watched. Her instincts sharpened instantly. She moved off the trail and climbed toward higher ground overlooking the canyon floor. Snow crunched softly beneath her boots while dawn slowly began turning the eastern horizon dark blue behind the mountains. Visibility remained poor, but enough light now touched the valley for shapes to emerge from the storm. Claire settled behind a ridge and lifted the rifle scope toward the northern pass. At first she saw nothing except drifting snow and broken rock. Then a faint reflection flashed near the upper ridgeline. Glass. Someone observing the valley from elevation. Claire lowered herself immediately behind cover. Her breathing slowed into controlled rhythm. Not Taliban scouts. Too disciplined. Too patient. Whoever occupied that ridge had been trained to remain invisible. The realization tightened something cold inside her chest. Commander Cole had not simply survived the explosion. Someone was hunting him through the mountains. Claire carefully adjusted her position and studied the terrain map forming in her mind. The northern ridge overlooked every exit from the valley. Any movement toward extraction routes would be visible from there. Which meant the enemy expected survivors. She checked the ammunition remaining in her Barrett magazine. 4 rounds left. Not ideal. But enough. The wind howled harder through the canyon as dawn approached somewhere beyond the storm clouds. Claire reached into her pocket and looked once more at the brass shell casing she had found earlier near the blood trail. Then she looked north toward the ridge where the reflection had appeared. Her voice remained calm when she finally spoke aloud to the empty valley. "You are still alive, Commander." The snow continued falling around her while somewhere ahead in the mountains, unseen eyes waited for movement. Claire Bennett stayed motionless behind the frozen ridgeline for nearly 6 minutes after spotting the reflection on the northern slope. Snow gathered slowly across the shoulders of her camouflage jacket while the mountain wind swept through the canyon beneath her. Most soldiers would have mistaken the valley for empty terrain after the explosion. Claire knew better. Silence like this usually meant somebody was waiting for movement. Her eye remained fixed behind the cracked sniper scope as she studied the ridgeline again inch by inch. Nothing obvious appeared. No shifting shadows. No careless motion. Whoever occupied that position understood concealment. That alone narrowed the possibilities. The insurgent groups operating through these mountains rarely demonstrated patience at long range. This felt different. More disciplined. More deliberate. Claire slowly lowered the rifle and checked the valley below again. Snow had already begun burying the convoy route beneath pale drifts. By midday the entire blast site would disappear beneath fresh weather. Whatever evidence remained out here would vanish with it. Which meant Commander Ethan Cole had left the trail intentionally before conditions erased everything. Another gust of wind swept across the canyon. Claire reached for the radio clipped to her vest and adjusted the damaged antenna carefully. Static crackled through the speaker before a voice finally broke through. Any surviving units respond immediately. The signal faded. Then returned stronger. This is Falcon Command. Rescue operations begin at daylight. All remaining personnel ordered to fall back south for extraction. Claire remained silent. The voice continued. Repeat. No teams are authorized beyond the southern pass. Survivors proceed to extraction immediately. Claire stared toward the northern mountains while the transmission repeated again. They were abandoning the search area. Either headquarters believed Commander Cole was already dead, or they feared something worse remained inside the valley. She keyed the mic once. Falcon Command, this is Overwatch 3. I have evidence Commander Cole survived the blast. Several seconds passed before the reply came back sharper now. Identify yourself. Staff Sergeant Claire Bennett. More static. Then another unfamiliar voice joined the channel. Older. Colder. Bennett, this is Lieutenant Harris at Regional Command. Your vitals beacon disappeared 4 hours ago. We already marked your position lost. Claire looked down at the blinking emergency tracker attached to her vest. The casing had cracked during the explosion. No wonder rescue teams passed overhead earlier without stopping. Commander Cole left a recorded transmission, she said calmly. He said the convoy was compromised before the explosion. Silence answered her for nearly 3 full seconds. Long enough to notice. Then Harris spoke again, slower this time. That is impossible. Claire narrowed her eyes slightly. Not impossible. Uncomfortable. I found drag marks leading north. Fresh blood trail. Someone moved him. Negative, Harris replied immediately. Your priority is extraction. Sir, there are trained personnel operating in these mountains right now. Bennett. His tone hardened. That is an order. The radio hissed softly between them. Claire looked again toward the northern ridge where she had seen the reflection earlier. Still nothing moved. Yet the feeling remained. Watched. Measured. Somewhere up there another scope could already be pointed directly at her position. If Cole carried classified material, she asked quietly, who else knew the convoy route? No answer came at first. Then the line crackled once more. You are injured and isolated, Harris said carefully. Do not attempt heroics. Fall back south immediately. Claire listened to the wind moving through the speaker behind his voice. Office noise. Multiple radios. Command tense. Safe distance. Meanwhile the mountains around her felt colder by the minute. She remembered something Ethan Cole once told a room full of sniper candidates during advanced Overwatch certification. People make their clearest decisions when nobody is coming to help them. At the time Claire thought the statement sounded harsh. Now she understood it perfectly. The radio buzzed again. Bennett, confirm you are moving south. Claire slowly unclipped the transmitter from her vest and looked at it for a long moment. Then she pressed the mic one final time. Commander Cole is still alive. Harris answered immediately. You do not know that. Claire's eyes settled on the snow-covered trail disappearing north through the mountains. Yes, she said quietly. I do. She released the button and switched the radio off completely. Silence returned at once. Cleaner now. Honest. Claire secured the Barrett rifle against her shoulder and began climbing higher along the eastern ridge instead of retreating south. The terrain steepened quickly, forcing her to move carefully between frozen rock formations slick with snow and ice. Every few steps she paused to scan the surrounding slopes for movement. Dawn had finally begun bleeding pale light across the horizon behind the mountains, turning the storm clouds dark blue. Visibility improved slightly with every passing minute. Enough to reveal danger sooner. Enough to make her easier to spot too. About 30 minutes later Claire reached a narrow shelf overlooking the northern pass. From there she could see nearly half a mile across the valley. Her breath slowed as she studied the terrain below through the damaged scope. Then she saw them. 3 figures moving carefully through the lower canyon floor nearly 400 yards away. White winter camouflage. Professional spacing. Controlled movement patterns. Not local fighters. One of them stopped beside the frozen trail in the snow exactly where Ethan Cole's blood marks disappeared earlier. The man crouched briefly, studying the tracks before pointing north toward higher ground. Tracking team. Claire settled lower against the rocks immediately. Her pulse remained steady, but something colder settled inside her chest now. Commander Cole was not simply lost in the mountains anymore. Someone was hunting him systematically before daylight reached the valley. And now they knew exactly where to look. Claire Bennett remained hidden beneath the ridge for several minutes after spotting the three men tracking through the valley below. The snowstorm had weakened slightly with dawn approaching, but cold blue light now exposed more of the mountains with every passing minute. Visibility worked both ways. She could see farther now, which meant they could see farther too. Claire studied the men carefully through the cracked edge of her sniper scope. Their movements confirmed everything her instincts had warned her about. They were not wandering fighters searching blindly through the valley. They moved with precision. One advanced while the other two covered separate angles. Every few yards they stopped to scan higher elevations before continuing north along the same trail Ethan Cole had left behind. Professional hunters. Claire lowered the rifle slowly and exhaled through clenched teeth as another wave of pain rolled through her shoulder. Her body had started stiffening from the cold. She needed warmth, rest, medical attention, and extraction. Instead she shifted her rifle strap tighter and began climbing farther north above the canyon to stay ahead of the tracking team below. The mountain terrain became steeper as she ascended. Jagged stone cut through the snow in sharp black ridges while loose ice cracked beneath her boots. Claire moved carefully, testing every foothold before placing her weight down fully. One mistake on these slopes could send rocks sliding through the valley and reveal her position instantly. The wind strengthened again around sunrise, carrying frozen snow sideways across the cliffs. Claire pulled her scarf higher across her face and paused beneath a narrow rock overhang overlooking the pass ahead. From there she could see where the valley split into two separate routes through the mountains. One path descended west toward abandoned villages near the border. The other climbed deeper north through isolated terrain where rescue helicopters would struggle to operate safely. Ethan Cole had chosen the northern route. Of course he had. Claire crouched beside the snow and studied the trail more closely. Most people looked at tracks and saw footprints. Snipers saw timelines. Distances between steps. Weight distribution. Direction changes. Signs of fatigue. Ethan's movement pattern had changed during the last half mile. His left boot dragged slightly now. His stride shortened. He was weakening. But he was still moving with purpose. Claire touched the frozen edge of one footprint carefully. The snow beneath remained compressed but not fully hardened yet. Less than 2 hours old. He was closer than she thought. Then she noticed something else. A second set of tracks intersected briefly with Ethan's trail before disappearing east along the ridge. Smaller boots. Lighter weight. Someone had shadowed him recently without engaging. Claire narrowed her eyes. Not the tracking team below. Different movement pattern entirely. Whoever crossed Ethan's route knew how to avoid leaving signs behind. The realization settled heavily in her chest. There were more people in these mountains than Command realized. A sudden crackling sound interrupted the wind near her vest. Claire froze instantly before realizing it came from the damaged recorder inside her pocket. The weak battery flickered again unexpectedly. She removed the device carefully and pressed the speaker closer to her ear. Static hissed for several seconds before a fragment of recorded audio emerged beneath interference. Ethan Cole's voice sounded weaker this time. "If Bennett is alive," the message distorted heavily. "Then returned. She will see what others miss." Claire remained perfectly still. Snow drifted across her sleeves while the recorder continued playing fragments between bursts of static. Northern Ridge, False Trail, the audio cut again before ending completely. Claire stared at the dead recorder for several seconds. Then she slowly lifted her eyes toward the split in the valley ahead. False trail. Ethan had expected pursuit. Which meant one of these mountain routes was intentionally misleading anyone tracking him. She studied the terrain again carefully through narrowed eyes. The western path appeared easier. Wider ground. Better cover. Logical route for an injured man seeking survival. Which was exactly why Ethan would avoid it. Claire looked north toward the harsher elevation instead. Narrow ridges. Limited shelter. Dangerous terrain. The route most people would reject immediately. Ethan Cole had trained operators for years using the same philosophy. Never move where the enemy expects comfort. Move where they hesitate to follow. Claire slid the recorder back into her pocket and turned toward the northern ascent. The climb became brutal within minutes. Snow deepened past her knees in places while freezing wind whipped across exposed ridgelines hard enough to steal breath from her lungs. Several times she stopped behind rocks to steady herself as dizziness threatened her balance. Blood loss and exhaustion were catching up slowly now. But every time her pace slowed, she remembered the tracking team moving through the valley below. They were still coming. Around mid-morning Claire finally reached a narrow ledge overlooking a frozen ravine nearly 300 feet beneath her. She dropped low immediately as fresh movement caught her eye across the opposite slope. One figure. Alone this time. White camouflage blending almost perfectly against the snow. The man knelt beside a rock formation scanning the ridges with binoculars. Counter-sniper posture. Patient. Calculated. Claire remained absolutely still behind her cover while cold wind carried snow between them. The distance measured roughly 600 yards across unstable air currents. Difficult shot even under perfect conditions. But that was not what unsettled her most. What unsettled her was the direction the man faced. He was not searching randomly through the mountains anymore. He was watching the exact route Ethan Cole would have chosen. Which meant someone else besides Claire understood how Commander Cole thought. And somewhere beyond the ridge ahead, Ethan was running out of time. Claire Bennett kept her body pressed against the frozen rock while the lone figure across the ravine continued scanning the mountain slopes through binoculars. Snow moved steadily between them in thin silver waves beneath the growing daylight. At this distance the man appeared almost invisible against the terrain, his white camouflage blending perfectly into the ridgeline. Only small details gave him away. The shape of his posture. The rhythm of his movements. The discipline. Claire adjusted the cracked edge of her scope carefully and studied him through controlled breaths. No insignia. No exposed skin. Professional cold weather gear with custom webbing designed for mobility instead of bulk. His rifle rested beside him partially buried beneath snow camouflage. Long barrel. Suppressor. Precision platform. Counter-sniper equipment. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. Whoever these men were, they had prepared specifically for this environment. That realization carried more weight than the storm pressing against the mountains around her. The explosion in the valley had not been an improvised ambush. It had been planned by people who understood military movement patterns and sniper overwatch positions. Claire remained perfectly still while the wind shifted again across the ravine. Then the man suddenly lowered his binoculars and turned his head slightly toward the eastern ridge. Toward her direction. Claire froze instantly. Every muscle locked into silence. The world narrowed to breathing, snow, and distance. Seconds passed. Then the man slowly reached for the radio clipped beneath his jacket and spoke into it briefly before standing. He did not search further. He simply gathered his rifle and disappeared behind the rocks with calm efficiency. Claire exhaled slowly through clenched teeth. He had not spotted her. But he had received new information. She checked the terrain quickly through the scope again and saw movement farther north near the upper ridgeline. 2 additional figures emerging from the snow. They were converging now. tightening the search area. Claire slid backward from the ledge and moved carefully along the slope until the ravine disappeared behind her. Her shoulder burned harder with every movement, but she ignored it the same way she ignored the freezing numbness spreading through her fingers. Pain meant she was still conscious. Still moving. That was enough. The northern route climbed sharply into higher elevation where the mountain air thinned noticeably. Snowdrifts deepened around exposed cliffs while jagged rocks cut through the terrain like broken teeth. Claire advanced slowly, following signs most people would never notice. Disturbed frost beneath overhangs. Scratches against stone where equipment brushed too close during movement. Small compressed areas in the snow where someone had paused to rest briefly before continuing. Ethan Cole was still ahead of her. Still moving north. But he was slowing down. Around noon the storm clouds began thinning enough for pale sunlight to break across the mountains for the first time since the explosion. Visibility improved rapidly. Dangerous conditions for anyone trying to stay hidden. Claire reached a narrow shelf overlooking another section of frozen canyon and immediately stopped. Something below caught her attention. A body lay partially buried beneath windblown snow near the rocks. Claire lowered herself carefully down the slope, rifle ready, until she reached the figure. Male. Heavy winter camouflage. One of the trackers. But something about the scene felt wrong immediately. There were no signs of struggle nearby. No chaotic movement. The man simply lay against the stone with snow drifting over him quietly. Claire crouched beside him and studied the area first before touching anything. Then she noticed the rifle beside his body. Foreign custom build. High-end optics. Professional tuning. Not equipment carried by insurgent fighters operating in remote villages. She checked the man's tactical vest next. Inside one pocket sat a laminated identification card with no flag, no nation, and no military branch listed. Only a name. Victor Hale. Beneath it rested a silver coin stamped with a Black Hawk insignia. Claire stared at the symbol for several seconds. She had seen it once before during classified threat briefings overseas. Private military contractors. Ghost units used for operations governments refused to acknowledge publicly. Her pulse slowed further now. Commander Cole had not been ambushed by random enemies in the mountains. Someone had hired professionals to intercept the convoy. Claire looked again at the tracker lying silently beneath the snow. Then she noticed something else resting beneath his gloved hand. A folded topographic map. She pulled it free carefully and opened it against the wind. Several routes through the mountains had been marked in black ink. Most were crossed out. Only one remained circled heavily near the northern ridge. Claire followed the marked route with her eyes until it stopped beside a location labeled only by grid coordinates. No village. No structure. Just a hidden point deep within the mountains less than 4 miles ahead. Her breathing slowed. Ethan was heading there. Or had already reached it. Then she saw another line written beside the coordinates in sharp block letters. Secure before dawn. The exact words from Ethan's broken transmission. Claire folded the map quickly as realization settled heavily into her chest. Whatever Commander Cole carried had not only survived the explosion. Multiple teams were racing to recover it before rescue forces arrived at daylight. A sharp sound suddenly echoed faintly through the canyon behind her. Not gunfire. Rock movement. Claire turned instantly toward the southern ridge and saw fresh snow sliding from higher elevation. Someone approaching fast. She grabbed the map, secured it inside her jacket, and moved uphill immediately. Wind howled harder through the mountains now while sunlight reflected sharply across the snowfields around her. Somewhere ahead Ethan Cole was still alive. Somewhere behind her trained hunters were closing in. And for the first time since the explosion, Claire Bennett understood the real mission hidden beneath the valley ambush. Commander Cole was never the target alone. Something he carried mattered even more. Claire Bennett climbed steadily toward the northern coordinates marked on the stolen map while daylight spread across the mountains in cold silver layers. The storm had weakened enough for long visibility across the ridges now, and that changed everything. Snow no longer concealed movement the way darkness had during the night. Every exposed slope became dangerous. Every ridgeline became a possible firing angle. Claire moved carefully between rock formations, keeping low whenever she crossed open terrain. The mountains around her had fallen completely silent again except for the wind pushing through the frozen passes. No birds. No distant engines. No radio chatter. Only the sound of snow grinding beneath her boots and the occasional crack of shifting ice somewhere high above the canyon walls. She checked the map again briefly while sheltering behind a narrow ridge. The marked coordinates lay less than 2 miles ahead now beyond a series of steep cliffs leading into a hidden ravine. Ethan Cole had chosen difficult terrain deliberately. Few people would attempt this route while injured. Fewer still would survive it in winter conditions. Claire folded the map and slipped it back into her jacket before scanning the ridge ahead through her damaged scope. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then a faint disturbance caught her attention near the snow line above the ravine entrance. Not movement. Absence. One section of snow reflected sunlight differently than the surrounding slope. Subtle. Almost invisible. Claire lowered herself immediately behind cover. Snow camouflage netting. Someone concealed along the ridge. Her pulse slowed into the calm rhythm sniper training demanded under pressure. Observe. Calculate. Breathe. The hidden position overlooked the exact approach route leading toward the coordinates on the map. Whoever occupied that ridge expected survivors to come through here eventually. Claire adjusted the scope carefully and studied the angle. The concealment was excellent. No exposed barrel. No visible outline. But one detail betrayed the position. Tiny flashes of reflected light appearing for fractions of a second whenever the wind shifted snow away from the optic lens. Scope glint. Claire's breathing slowed further. Counter-sniper overwatch. Professional. Patient. Waiting. She slid backward carefully behind the rocks and checked the surrounding terrain. The ravine below offered no safe crossing under observation. Anyone descending directly into it would become exposed for nearly 200 yards. A perfect kill zone. Ethan Cole would have recognized that immediately. Which meant he either found another route through the cliffs or never reached the ravine at all. Claire looked higher toward the western ridge and noticed faint scrape marks along the stone. Climbing signs. Difficult path. Dangerous in winter conditions. Exactly the kind of route Ethan would choose when avoiding surveillance. She began moving west immediately, staying low while circling above the hidden sniper position from higher elevation. The climb tested every remaining ounce of strength left in her body. Her shoulder felt stiff and heavy now while exhaustion pressed harder against her focus with every passing minute. More than once she slipped against loose ice and caught herself against the rocks before falling. But she kept moving. The hidden sniper below remained motionless throughout the entire ascent. That discipline unsettled her more than aggression would have. Around 40 minutes later Claire finally reached a narrow overlook nearly 100 feet above the concealed position. Wind blasted across the ridge hard enough to sting exposed skin while sunlight reflected sharply from the snowfields around her. She settled behind a frozen rock shelf and slowly raised the Barrett rifle into position. Through the scope the concealed sniper finally became visible beneath layers of white netting and snow camouflage. Male. Mid-sized build. Suppressed rifle pointed directly toward the ravine entrance below. Completely focused on the valley. He had no idea Claire now watched him from above. Claire steadied her breathing carefully while adjusting for distance and crosswind. 612 yards. Strong western gusts. Damaged scope alignment. Difficult shot even under calm conditions. She closed one eye briefly and listened to the wind against the rocks around her. Ethan Cole used to tell sniper candidates that mountains breathe differently than flat ground. Wind moved through valleys in invisible currents that changed by the second. Most shooters fought the mountain. Good snipers listened to it first. Claire waited. Another gust swept snow across the ridge below. Then the air shifted briefly calm for half a heartbeat. Claire squeezed the trigger. The suppressed Barrett cracked sharply against the mountains while recoil pushed into her shoulder like a hammer. Across the ridge the concealed sniper jerked sideways beneath the camouflage netting and disappeared from sight behind the rocks. Silence returned instantly afterward. Snow continued blowing through the empty ridge as if nothing had happened at all. Claire did not celebrate. Did not move immediately. She stayed behind the rifle studying the area through the scope for several long seconds. No secondary movement. No return fire. Nothing. Then suddenly a burst of radio chatter crackled faintly below from the hidden sniper's fallen position. Multiple voices speaking rapidly through static. The search teams had heard the shot. Claire lowered the rifle and immediately shifted away from her firing point before they triangulated the sound. She moved quickly along the ridge despite the pain tearing through her shoulder now. Snow sprayed behind her boots while wind howled harder across the cliffs. Far below in the canyon she could already see movement beginning near the lower passes. The hunters were repositioning. Searching higher elevations now. Searching for her. Claire reached another rock formation overlooking the ravine entrance and finally stopped long enough to steady her breathing again. Then she saw it. Hidden beneath the cliff wall below sat a narrow opening almost invisible beneath snowdrifts and shadow. A cave entrance. Beside it, barely visible against the rocks, hung a strip of black tactical fabric tied deliberately to a branch. Seal recognition marker. Ethan Cole had reached the coordinates. Claire Bennett stared at the narrow cave entrance beneath the cliff wall while snow swept across the ravine in silver waves. The black strip of tactical fabric tied near the rocks moved gently in the wind, barely visible against the frozen terrain. Ethan Cole had left the marker deliberately. Not for rescue teams. For someone trained to notice details everyone else ignored. Claire scanned the surrounding ridges through her scope one final time before moving downhill toward the cave. The mountains had grown dangerously quiet after the sniper shot. No more radio chatter echoed through the valleys now. No visible movement below. That silence meant the tracking teams were adapting. Searching more carefully. The hunters knew another trained operator had entered the game. Claire descended slowly through the ravine, keeping close to the cliff shadows while loose snow shifted beneath her boots. Her shoulder had gone numb hours ago, replaced by a heavy stiffness spreading across her arm and upper back. Fatigue clouded the edges of her vision whenever she moved too quickly. But the sight of the cave ahead kept her focused. Ethan was close now. Closer than he had been since the explosion. As she approached the entrance she noticed additional signs hidden near the rocks. A small stack of stones arranged unnaturally beside the path. Scratches carved lightly into the cliff face. Directional markers. Escape indicators. Ethan Cole had prepared fallback routes even while injured and hunted through the mountains. Claire crouched beside the cave opening and listened carefully before entering. Nothing answered except the distant howl of wind through the ravine outside. She removed a small flashlight from her vest but kept it switched off. Light traveled too easily inside mountain caves. Instead she waited until her eyes adjusted to the darkness before stepping carefully inside. The air changed immediately. Colder. Still. The cave stretched deeper into the mountain than she expected, twisting through narrow stone walls coated with ice. Snowdrifts reached several feet high near the entrance but thinned farther inside where the rock blocked the wind. Claire moved silently through the darkness with the Barrett rifle raised. Then she heard it. Breathing. Slow. Uneven. She stopped instantly. Commander Cole, she said quietly. Silence followed for 2 full seconds. Then a weak voice answered from deeper within the cave. You are either very stubborn, Bennett, or very bad at following orders. Relief hit her harder than she expected. Ethan was alive. Claire followed the voice through the shadows until the cave widened into a narrow chamber partially sheltered from the cold. Commander Ethan Cole sat against the stone wall wrapped in a thermal blanket stained with snow and dirt. One leg had been secured with an improvised splint made from broken equipment straps and climbing poles. His face looked pale beneath the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, but his eyes remained sharp and alert the moment he saw her. Even injured, he still carried the same calm presence every operator in task unit raider respected. Claire lowered the rifle slowly. Command marked everyone dead, she said. Ethan gave a tired smile that barely appeared beneath the exhaustion. That usually improves morale. Claire stepped closer and finally noticed the hard black case resting beside him against the cave wall. Small. Reinforced. Military encryption lock built into the frame. The object everyone had been hunting through the mountains. Ethan followed her eyes toward the case immediately. You figured it out. Claire nodded once. The convoy was never the mission. Ethan leaned his head carefully against the stone behind him. The drive inside that case contains names, offshore accounts, movement schedules. Contractors selling operational routes to hostile groups across the region. His voice stayed steady despite exhaustion. Some very powerful people would rather bury this mountain than let that information leave Afghanistan. Claire glanced toward the cave entrance instinctively. The tracking teams. The ambush. The professionals in white camouflage. Suddenly every piece fit together. Command knows, she asked quietly. Ethan remained silent for a moment before answering. Some do. Some do not. The uncertainty in his voice unsettled her more than anything she had seen outside. Claire crouched beside the cave wall and removed a small emergency water pack from her vest, handing it toward him. Ethan accepted it slowly with stiff hands. How did you find this place? He asked after taking a drink. Claire reached into her pocket and placed the cracked recorder beside him. You left enough clues. Ethan stared at the recorder briefly before looking back at her. I hoped you survived the blast. Claire gave a faint shrug. You taught us not to die in predictable places. For the first time since she entered the cave, Ethan laughed quietly beneath his breath. The sound lasted only a moment before fatigue overtook it again. Claire studied him more carefully now under the dim light. He had lost a dangerous amount of energy moving through the mountains alone overnight. Even if they escaped the hunters outside, he would never survive another full day crossing these ridges without extraction. Ethan seemed to read the thought in her expression immediately. No helicopters are coming here, he said quietly. The moment rescue birds enter these valleys, every hostile team in the region will know exactly where we are. Claire looked back toward the cave entrance where pale daylight reflected across the snow outside. Then we move before dark. Ethan watched her silently for several seconds. You already crossed half these mountains alone, Bennett. Claire adjusted the Barrett rifle against her shoulder without looking away from the entrance. I was not alone. Ethan frowned slightly. Claire's eyes remained fixed on the storm outside while her voice dropped lower. They followed me here. Almost on cue, a faint sound echoed somewhere beyond the ravine entrance. Snow crunching beneath careful boots. The sound outside the cave came again. Slow footsteps pressing carefully through fresh snow. Claire Bennett moved toward the entrance immediately while Ethan Cole reached for the sidearm resting beside the encrypted case. The daylight outside had shifted pale gray beneath thick clouds rolling back across the mountains. Another storm was moving in fast. Claire lowered herself beside the cave wall and peered carefully through the narrow opening overlooking the ravine below. At first she saw nothing except drifting snow and jagged stone. Then movement appeared near the lower ridge. Two figures advancing cautiously between the rocks with rifles raised. They were searching methodically now, scanning every elevation before moving forward. Claire counted several more shadows farther behind them near the ravine entrance. The tracking teams had finally closed the distance. Ethan studied the cave from behind her with calm eyes despite the exhaustion weighing heavily across his face. How long before they find us? Claire remained focused on the ravine outside. They already know we are here. The words settled heavily inside the cave. Ethan looked toward the encrypted case beside him. Then we move now. Claire nodded once. She reached into the side pouch attached to her vest and removed two compact claymore mines wrapped in weatherproof tape. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. You carried those through the mountains? Claire began securing one near the cave entrance with practiced hands. I carried worse things in sniper school. Ethan almost smiled despite the situation. Outside, the footsteps in the snow continued growing closer. Claire armed the first claymore low against the rock wall, positioning it carefully to cover the narrow approach leading toward the cave. The second she attached farther uphill beneath a snowdrift overlooking the alternate ridge path. Not designed to cause chaos. Designed to slow pursuit long enough to escape. Ethan watched her work silently for several seconds before speaking again. You planned ahead. Claire adjusted the detonator wire beneath the snow. You taught us to. Ethan leaned carefully against the cave wall and studied her with quiet respect that carried more weight than praise ever could. Most operators inside Task Unit Raider knew Claire Bennett as the quiet sniper who rarely spoke during briefings and disappeared after missions without drawing attention. Few understood how carefully she listened to every lesson, every detail, every survival principle Ethan Cole taught over the years. The wind outside suddenly howled harder through the ravine. Snow blasted across the cave entrance while distant voices echoed faintly somewhere below the cliffs. The hunters were splitting up now. One team climbing higher. Another moving directly toward the cave. Claire finished securing the detonators and returned beside Ethan. Can you walk? Ethan glanced down at the improvised splint on his leg before answering honestly. Not fast. Claire picked up the encrypted case and secured it across her back beside the Barrett rifle. Then she crouched beside him and extended an arm beneath his shoulder. Fast is relative. Ethan stood slowly with visible effort while the cave walls groaned softly beneath another blast of mountain wind outside. The moment he placed weight on his injured leg, tension crossed his face briefly before disappearing again behind discipline. Claire adjusted her stance immediately to support more of his balance. There is another route, he asked quietly. Claire nodded toward the rear of the cave where darkness narrowed into a steep stone passage barely visible behind drifting shadows. Higher elevation tunnel. Leads west across the ridge. Ethan frowned slightly. That route was buried years ago. Not completely. Claire had noticed the hidden airflow earlier while moving through the cave. Cold wind entering through cracks deeper inside the mountain. Another exit existed somewhere beyond the tunnel. The voices outside grew clearer now. Close enough to hear boots scraping rock beneath the snow. Claire guided Ethan toward the rear passage just as a flashlight beam briefly swept across the cave entrance. Both of them froze instantly against the shadows. The light disappeared a second later. Then came the sound of someone moving cautiously toward the opening. Claire reached for the detonator trigger clipped beneath her glove while supporting Ethan with her other arm. Neither of them spoke. Time slowed into breathing, footsteps, and wind. Then a sharp voice echoed from outside. Tracks lead inside. Claire waited one more second. Then she pressed the trigger. The claymore near the entrance detonated with a heavy blast that thundered through the ravine and shook snow loose from the cliffs above. Rock and ice crashed across the entrance while startled voices shouted outside beneath the roar of collapsing snow. Claire immediately pulled Ethan deeper into the tunnel before the dust settled. The narrow passage twisted sharply upward through darkness barely wide enough for both of them to move side by side. Snow and stone rumbled faintly behind them while the blocked cave entrance filled with debris. Claire switched on a dim red flashlight attached beneath her rifle and guided Ethan carefully through the tunnel. The air grew colder deeper inside the mountain. Sharp ice coated the walls while freezing water dripped somewhere ahead into darkness. Ethan's breathing became heavier with every step, but he kept moving without complaint. After nearly 15 exhausting minutes, the tunnel finally widened toward faint daylight filtering through cracks above. Claire extinguished the light immediately and approached the opening carefully. She pushed aside loose snow blocking the exit and looked out across the western ridge. The sight beyond stopped her cold. Two black helicopters circled low across the distant valley several miles south, moving slowly between the mountains beneath the storm clouds. No military markings. No rescue insignia. Private aircraft. Searching. Ethan appeared beside her shoulder and saw them too. His voice dropped lower than before. They brought extraction teams. Claire studied the helicopters carefully while snow drifted across the ridge around them. Not for us. Claire Bennett watched the black helicopters circle through the distant valley while snow drifted across the western ridge around her. Their movements were slow and controlled, sweeping across the mountains in deliberate patterns rather than random searches. Professional pilots. Professional crews. They were not rescue teams responding to missing operators. They were hunting for the encrypted drive strapped across Claire's back. Ethan Cole leaned heavily against the tunnel wall beside her, studying the aircraft through narrowed eyes. If they secure the drive before military extraction arrives, he said quietly, everything inside it disappears. Claire kept scanning the ridges below them. Then we move before they close the valley. The storm clouds gathering overhead darkened the mountains again while wind pushed fresh snow across the cliffs. Visibility would collapse within another hour once the second storm arrived. Dangerous conditions for travel. Perfect conditions for disappearing. Claire guided Ethan carefully along the western ridge away from the tunnel exit while the helicopters continued circling several miles south. The terrain here descended through narrow rock shelves and frozen switchbacks leading toward lower elevation valleys beyond the mountains. Hard travel even for healthy operators. Ethan's injured leg slowed them steadily, but he refused to stop moving despite exhaustion visible in every step. Claire adjusted her pace automatically to match his without speaking. Hours passed beneath the worsening storm. Snow thickened again around the ridges while fading daylight turned the mountains gray beneath the clouds. More than once Claire stopped to scan the valleys below through her damaged scope. The helicopters remained distant at first. Then gradually they began moving north. Closing the search pattern. At dusk they reached a narrow overlook above an abandoned Soviet listening station half buried beneath snow and rock. The structure sat hidden against the mountainside nearly invisible from the air. Ethan stopped the moment he saw it. I know this place. Claire studied the frozen bunker entrance ahead. Can it hold until morning? Ethan nodded once. It has military comm equipment underground. Old but functional if the generators still work. They moved inside quickly as the storm intensified around the mountains. The bunker smelled of rust, dust, and frozen concrete untouched for years. Broken equipment lined the walls while old radio consoles sat buried beneath layers of debris. Claire secured the entrance behind them before helping Ethan down beside the central communications table. For the first time since the explosion she allowed herself to breathe fully. Shelter. Temporary safety. Heatless but protected from the storm outside. Ethan leaned back against the wall, exhaustion finally overtaking the calm discipline that had carried him through the mountains. Claire immediately began searching the bunker for anything usable. Batteries. Power cells. Emergency fuel. After nearly 20 minutes she found an old backup generator buried beneath collapsed shelving in the rear storage room. The machine groaned violently when she started it, but moments later dim yellow lights flickered alive throughout the bunker. Ethan looked toward her from across the room with tired disbelief. You really do notice things others miss. Claire removed snow from her gloves beside the generator. You said that on the recorder. Ethan stared at her quietly for several seconds before answering. Because it was true. The old communications console crackled weakly as power returned to the bunker systems. Static filled the room beneath the hum of the generator. Claire moved toward the radio equipment immediately and adjusted the frequency controls carefully. Most channels returned only interference. Then finally a clear military signal cut through the static. Task Unit Raider extraction inbound to Northern Valley at 0600 hours. Claire and Ethan exchanged a quick look. Real rescue teams. Finally. The transmission continued. Surviving personnel confirm authentication codes immediately. Ethan reached slowly into his vest pocket and removed a classified signal beacon no larger than a deck of cards. He placed it carefully beside the console. Once this activates, he said quietly, every aircraft in these mountains will know our location. Claire looked toward the bunker entrance while wind howled outside beneath the growing storm. Then we hold until extraction. Ethan studied her face beneath the dim bunker lights. You have been holding this entire mission together since the blast. Claire said nothing. She simply checked the remaining ammunition in the Barrett rifle before positioning herself near the entrance overlooking the snowy valley outside. Night settled heavily across the mountains while the storm intensified around the bunker. Hours passed slowly beneath the sound of wind against frozen concrete. Claire remained awake the entire time, scanning the darkness through the scope whenever visibility allowed. Sometime after midnight she finally saw distant lights moving through the storm far below. Vehicles. Multiple. Heading directly toward the listening station. Ethan noticed her posture change immediately. How many? Enough. Claire switched off the bunker lights at once. Darkness swallowed the room except for faint radio indicators glowing beside the console. Outside, the storm continued raging across the mountains. Then suddenly another sound emerged beneath the wind. Helicopter rotors. Closer this time. Much closer. Ethan activated the rescue beacon without hesitation. A sharp-coded pulse echoed through the radio system and disappeared into the storm outside. Seconds later every radio frequency inside the bunker exploded with overlapping chatter. The hunters had their signal. So did the rescue teams. Claire settled behind the rifle overlooking the valley while snow blasted across the shattered windows around her. Lights moved through the darkness below as the black helicopters descended toward the ridge line. Then another sound rolled through the mountains from the opposite direction. Different engines. Larger aircraft. Military rescue birds cutting through the storm clouds overhead. Ethan looked toward Claire through the darkness. You got us this far. Claire kept her eye behind the scope watching the helicopters approach through the snow. Not yet. The next 15 minutes passed in chaos of wind, engines, radio chatter, and blinding snow. Shapes moved across the valley beneath the storm while military helicopters descended hard onto the ridge above the bunker. Orders echoed through the darkness outside. Rescue operators flooded the mountainside with lights and secured the perimeter around the station. Claire never lowered the rifle until she saw the first American flag patch step through the bunker entrance. The operator stopped cold the moment he saw Ethan alive beside the encrypted case. Then his eyes shifted toward Claire Bennett standing guard beside the frozen window with the Barrett rifle still in her hands. Snow covered her uniform. Blood stained one sleeve. Exhaustion lined her face. But she was still standing. Ethan looked toward the stunned rescue team and spoke with quiet certainty that silenced the room instantly. Remember her name. No one answered at first. They simply stared at the sniper who crossed the mountains alone, survived the blast, protected the drive, and brought their commander home through the storm. Outside, dawn finally began breaking across the Afghan mountains in pale silver light. And for the first time since the explosion shattered the valley, the mountains no longer felt silent.